Hello, world. Welcome to the Speed Strength Show. I'm Braden.
I'm Tommy. And is the word hamstring a verb
Hmm. That's like to be hamstringed,
or hamstrung?
to be hamstrung.
Because I read it in an article the other day. They were referring to something being hamstrung.
Huh. What's the, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I've heard that before too, I think.
And I
But
kind of,
what would it mean?
well, so like I was reading an article on, they were doing a review of a road test for a car. And this particular car had less horsepower than the other models in the same class of car.
Hmm.
But then they said, oh, the car isn't hamstrung by the lack of power in terms of its on-road performance. Like they said, it still picked up well. It passed on the highway. It did all those other things. And I was just kind of like, can you use hamstring as a verb? I don't really like that either. That's like a negative connotation.
Yeah, I don't think it sounds very nice, but I have heard it in that context as well, where it means like limited. Um,
And I don't think of the hamstring as limiting.
well, no, but I think the idea is maybe like if you're sprinting and your hamstring tears or strains or whatever, then now you're limited. You've been hamstrung.
But any muscle could tear. Well, maybe not any muscle, but more than just the hamstring could go wrong. I feel like it's
Yeah,
an
I don't know.
unfair
It's definitely the hamstring
representation.
doesn't. Yeah, the hamstring doesn't deserve that. I don't think.
Yeah, so not only do I think the hamstring doesn't necessarily deserve it because I think it's a fantastic muscle, a little biased, but but I just thought I was like, oh, that's a weird way to describe that.
Hmm. I do enjoy the idea of using words that are not verbs as verbs, though.
That's true. Do you have any example? Can you think of any examples?
Um, maybe like so you can cash a check. So in that sense, cash is a verb because you can do it, but you could think of making money as cashing. You know, it's not a good example. It's a bad. I've never used that in my life before,
Okay,
but
you've
on
never
the
said
spot,
caching.
no.
Okay, that's good.
but
That's good.
but on the spot, that's the best I can do right now.
I mean, yeah, I'm sure there's other examples of that, but I just thought it was weird. I was like, why would you
I,
say this car isn't hamstrung by its lack of power? I'm like, I think you could find a better way to say that.
yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
And I feel like like it's in a tough spot, man. Like as the
Yeah,
hamstring, you could sit there and go, look, you wedged me between two of the most powerful joints in the body. And anytime somebody screws something up and doesn't do it properly, I have to make up for it.
that's right.
So no wonder I tear all the time.
Yeah, that's right. We ask a lot of our hamstrings.
Yes, that's why I just feel like it's
Yeah.
not very nice to turn around and use it as a negative verb.
Hmm. Yeah, you're picking on it for all the times that it let you down when really you let it down.
Correct. You should try to find a way to positively spin that. I don't know how
Nice.
you would do it. Use as a positive verb.
I don't think why it doesn't have that connotation anymore. I think its name has been dragged through the mud.
Yeah, it's one of those words that just has I don't it's like an inherent positive or negative connotation to it because of
Yeah.
even if it
Yeah.
doesn't, like I don't know, do you find the word concur kind of strange? I think concur sounds like if you say something and I say I concur, it sounds like I'm debating you or I'm disagreeing with you. Maybe that's just me, but I
I
know it means I would then be agreeing with you. But just
yeah.
the connotation or the tone, I don't know what it is. It just strikes me as a word that to me it should mean disagreement. Again, I don't know why. Maybe it's just
I
the way
yeah.
I perceive
I
it.
mean, I haven't felt that before, but I see that. I understand that. It does have that air about it. I think there's a lot of things about the English language that are just very weird. Obviously, we have a lot of exceptions, but just like when you say I don't like something in English, like to us, that means I hate it. You know,
Yeah.
there isn't a way to say I'm neutral about it. You say, like, if you don't like it, it means all it means is that you don't like it. That's good. And
Yeah.
it's just the absence of that, which is neutral, but it means that you hate it. And so there's no way to say how you actually feel.
The English language is something else. I actually have in my notebook of ideas for, I don't know what we call those lines at the start of the show when we just randomly put something out there, but I do have one about the English language that
Wow.
goes on a little bit of like what you've just talked about, because it's anarchy. It's madness.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to hear that one. And I'm impressed that you have, more than one idea. I'm just flying by the seat of my pants every week.
Well, if I hear something good, I'm like, let me write that down. Because I'm sure at some point we're going to be sitting here on whatever day when we decide to record. And I'm like, oh, I got 10 minutes to think of something. So I'm
Yeah.
just trying to stay ahead of the game. That's all.
Well, that's smart. I guess I just don't hear that many good things.
Need to get out more.
Yeah, it's tough these days.
It is tough. And I'm one to speak because I don't go out much. But,
Yeah.
I try. But yeah, I'm just trying to be prepared. That's really
Good stuff.
all
Good
it is.
stuff. Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm. Right on. So what are we talking about this week, Tom?
well, it kind of goes along the theme of being prepared
Mm-hmm.
and being able to assess weakness and decide maybe where's the best path for you to take somebody you're working with in terms of where they showing strengths, where they're showing deficits.
Mm-hmm.
What can we do to kind of tease that out and find solutions to make people better? And so
Yeah.
I think the more prepared you are with some sort of system or concept or whatever you want to call it that works for you, I think it is important that we have some sort of a way to identify weaknesses or areas that need improvement for people, because ultimately that's what we need to do as coaches is help people improve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely a way to figure out, like, you need to know where their goals are and where they are now, and you need a system that will tell you where the deficits are, where to focus your attention, and then using that same system, ideally review what you've done. How well did it work? How well didn't it work? What do we need to change going forward to get even better results the next time?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think today it'll be fun to kind of share some of our ideas. And I don't know what you refer to it as a concept or a system or a model or whatever, but kind of going through our ways of looking at athletes or people that we're working with and deciding, like you mentioned, how do we get them from point A to point B in a way that will work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. Well, I know you've got a little bit of a flow chart prepared.
I'm a big visuals person. Flow charts, things.
Yeah,
I almost everything I do, I like to be able to see. Okay, I'm going from here. I'm going to there. I'm doing
yeah.
this, going to that. So it's just the way my
Mm-hmm.
brain kind of works, right?
Yeah.
So
So I don't think you need to. I mean, you can if you want. I don't think you need to necessarily show the audience the flow chart. But
no, it can be described easily enough.
yeah, I have been very curious since we decided to talk about this. What you do to assess a sprinter's weakness.
Yeah, so we will
So I'm
definitely get
really
to that.
excited.
I'm stoked too, because I think this is, like I said, it's going to be interesting to kind of compare and contrast and what's the same, what's
Yeah,
different.
yeah,
I think there's a lot of ways that this can go depending on the person, their skill set, and you're starting to get into more the like the therapy medical side a little bit. So then does that start to, trickle into your assessments of weakness and things like that? So there's a lot of different ways to do this depending on your skill set. So to me, there's no one correct way to assess an
No,
individual. It's going to be based on the tools that you have in the toolbox, so to speak.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Your tools, and what you think is important based on your experiences and things. Um, but yeah, like let's say you're starting with a new sprinter.
Yeah.
What are you looking for? You know?
Well, the first thing, at least for me, is I need to know what I'm looking for. So the very first part of any movement, any action that an athlete might do. So in this case, it could be sprinting, could be squatting, could be a weight room movement, anything like that. I need to know what I'm looking for. So I need to have some sort of concept as to what do I think is the correct way to do that movement. And I like to look at it in terms of like a Venn diagram, right? The two circles that are overlapping. And basically what I like to do with a lot of movements is look at the different schools of thoughts. So there might be, method A of sprinting, method B, method C. Let's just hypothetically, let's say there's 3 different models of sprinting, and you put them into a Venn diagram. And to me, what I'm looking for is all the stuff that's the same between these different schools of thought. And if those things are the same, then that probably is the most important part of the movement and is the most important part that we should look for. So, for something like sprinting, I need to have an idea of what I'm actually looking at. So, there's different trains of thoughts, and different parts of the world and different coaches obviously emphasize different qualities. But if we're going to look at sprinting as an example, the one thing that's really common amongst everybody who is considered elite in the sport is the postures of the positions that they use. So sure, some people focus on, being bigger and stronger and putting more force into the ground. Some people maybe care more about, I guess that flow, the rhythm, things like that. But it doesn't matter. You look at all the great sprinters, whether it's in the past, whether it's now, and they hit certain postures and positions. So those are the things that I like to look for. And again, that could be the same for anything. I've done this with squatting. I've done this with weightlifting, done this with a number of different key movements or key elements in training where you go, let me look at all these different methods or schools of thought and what is the same. And those things are the same. That's what I end up focusing on. Because I think if you don't know what you're looking for, then it's really hard to compare to what you're seeing in front of you to then say, okay, well, what am I actually looking for? If I have no idea what good sprinting, good squatting, good weightlifting, good anything looks like in terms of a movement, and someone does it, then how do I actually know what to look for and going, oh, that posture's off or that movement looks a little flawed, right? So that's the starting point for everything that I do from a movement standpoint. I don't know if you look at anything in terms of, what do you view as the correct way or an incorrect way, for you personally to compare to. I don't know if you do something like that.
Yeah, it's a little bit, I guess it's a little bit more subconscious. The more you coach and stuff, everything kind of ends up becoming a little bit more by feel, I think. But I like how you said that for sure, is that you need the context if you're going to try to assess what can be better or what can be worse. You need the context first of like what's kind of the ideal. um, I think in powerlifting there is that kind of general concept as well, where you know everybody is going to squat differently, everyone's going to bench differently, everyone's going to deadlift differently. Same with sprinting, like everyone's going to sprint differently. Like the specifics as to how they get whatever job done is going to be different person to person based on their athletic history and injuries and anatomy and, all these different factors. But there are certain, like within the field or within that exercise or within that sport, whatever, there's certain things that are just generally accepted as like, you need to be doing this, and like the specifics as to the rest of the movement, those are going to change based on anatomy, based on all these other things. But um, there are, like powerlifting's a sport, so there are rules to the sport. So no matter how we squat, we need to make sure we're hitting depth. If we're not hitting depth, then we need to change something to make sure that we are, because that's a rule. Same with, the deadlift. If you have to hitch on the way up of your deadlift, then you're not deadlifting right. We need to change something so that you can deadlift more smoothly. And then there's the safety standpoint. If your technique puts you at a high degree of risk for injury, that's something we need to avoid. Obviously, we want to stay healthy. That's the best way to continue to progress. And as a coach, it's your responsibility to make sure that you're not putting your athletes at risk. So, a good core brace, a neutral enough spine, trying to make sure that our hips are stable, that our knees are stable, that our shoulders are stable. Those things are important. How you do it will change based on who you are and your anatomy and all those things, but you need to be doing it. That's something that's pretty much non-negotiable. And then efficiency and performance essentially is the last part, where there's generally accepted things like the shoulder stability and the core stability. All those things are generally accepted as important. There's different ideas as to how you go about doing it. And then that's where things get a lot more specific and can change based on the person. But the idea of what you're looking for doesn't really change. It's just you're trying to find that common ground based on what the ideal for the movement is, and then how that can be adapted to the specific person that you're working with.
Yeah, it's a great point that you brought up, the individual, because that's one of the things that's led me to really liking the Venn diagram, is basically anything that exists in the middle is non-negotiable. Like you mentioned, this is something you have to do. Anything that exists outside of the middle, in the other parts of the Venn diagram, that's whatever you want to call it, the personal style, the flair, the movement strategies. That's where the unique, movement solutions come into play for, an athlete is trying to figure out whatever movement, be it squatting, sprinting, whatever, and then how do they actually go about executing those rules or those non-negotiable points that you've given to them. So I really like that you brought that up, because again, that's an element of this as well that's led me to kind of go, I like this Venn diagram model, because it gives me a really good indication of, I'm seeing something that needs to be changed, or am I seeing something that's just their own individual way of doing it? Because sometimes, hey, if it's not broken, why try to fix it? And they might have something that they're doing that, with their hand or their upper body, for example, when they're sprinting, where I go, yeah, but they're still hitting all the positions that I told them to hit that are non-negotiable. So why am I going to go bother changing, how they're running, as an example, right? So I like that you brought that up, because again, that was a big reason behind, over the years, as I've kind of thought about how am I going to do this, what works for me, as to why this Venn diagram concept kind of registered with my brain in terms of how I do it. And then of course, the next part after you have that idea of what you're looking at is that compare contrast. And if it falls in the middle of the Venn diagram, then we need to change it. because, like you mentioned, that's something that's non-negotiable. We need this in order to perform at our highest level. So that's where you would identify, okay, this is a flaw or a movement error or a weakness of some kind that needs to be addressed. And then from there, you decide, okay, is this flaw or error? Is it mechanical or physical in nature? Or is it more of a cognitive or a perceptual problem? So is there something physically in terms of their body, whether it's mobility, rate of force development, strength, that's limiting them from performing this movement correctly? Or is it they haven't learned the skill yet, or they're thinking about it in the incorrect way, because that's going to end up changing or guiding how you actually go about addressing that change in that individual.
Hmm. Yeah, I like. Well, I like that you. First of all, I like that you think about it as the Venn diagram, and that you mentioned the there's things that are non-negotiable. If they're doing that, that's awesome. And if they're doing other things that are maybe not necessarily what we want, but they're not inhibiting the things that we do want, to like take a step back, and we don't need to mess with that, because I do think that sometimes people can get carried away, and I've definitely been guilty of it in the past, where
I think we all have.
the idea that you have in your head just becomes so important for whatever reason, and you're almost like, as a coach, I think sometimes you feel like you need to look for things that are wrong and like figure out why, like what can be better still. It's like we know that there's always things that you can improve, but you don't always need to be trying to improve something. Sometimes you just need to keep doing what you're doing and do it really well. So I
And
like that
what's
you brought
worth
up that point.
improving, right?
Well, exactly.
Like, is it
Exactly.
such a minor thing that you're viewing as quote unquote incorrect? And is it worth all the time and effort to go change that? Is it actually going to benefit the overall performance? Uh, Who
Exactly.
knows?
And that's something that you need to ask yourself, through this process, is how important is it? And, you bring it back to the Venn diagram. There's the middle, where these are the things we absolutely need. If we're not doing these things, then we need to figure out how we can do these things. And if it's something on the periphery, then, it's probably not that important unless it's inhibiting, you know? Um, yeah. And I think it's interesting how you break it down to physical and cognitive. I break things down in a very similar way. Um, with I have two sections for physical. One being things that you can't change, being like structural anatomy, bones and joints and things like that. So we need to figure out a way to work around your structural anatomy. Then there's other physical elements like force development, like muscle size, muscle strength activation, things like that, that we can change. And we can do hypertrophy, and we can do different activation drills and things like that. And then the cognitive side as well, where we're talking about cueing and different compensation patterns, or just flat out not understanding a skill, things like that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's a great, I'm going to paraphrase it, but there's a quote from like Nick Winkelman, and it's something along the lines of, you can't change like a physical problem with like a technical cue, right?
Yeah.
So maybe you want somebody to push the ground harder when they're sprinting, or you want somebody to get out of the hole better in a squat or something like that. But if they physically don't have the strength or the muscular capabilities of doing that, you can cue them all you want. But if they can't do it, they can't do it. So that's like, I love that quote from him. And I think that's one of the reasons why I like to look at it in terms of, okay, does this have to be fixed by changing our training or giving you a different exercise or, promoting a different goal in what we do on the track or in the weight room or whatever? Or is this something that I could actually try to address right now because it's something going on with the way that you're thinking about it or the way that you're trying to accomplish the task? So, and then once you've decided where it lies, that's going to lead you to, okay, there's these exercises I have to add in to improve your strength or rate of force development. Or maybe there's mobility that I have to prescribe to because your ankle's jammed up or your hips jammed up and it's not allowing you to get into the position. Or am I going to be on the other side of the fence and I'm thinking, okay, what are you trying to accomplish in this task? What are you trying to achieve? Maybe think about it this way. Let me give you a cue. I want you to strive for this or try to do that. And that's how we can end up trying to get you to a better spot. But yeah, I completely agree that, you do need to have an idea of that, because if you don't, then you could be giving the wrong solution to what it is that you're trying to fix. And that won't actually help you progress forward.
Yeah, I think, well, I'm glad you said that that quote. I've never heard that before. And I think that's amazing. That's such a smart way to put it. And it's true. Like it doesn't matter. So an example from powerlifting, if you are squatting a very heavy weight, for most people, their quads are going to be the limiting factor. So they shoot their hips back in their squat, and you can fix that problem by saying, keep your knees forward coming out of the hole. But if their quads are weak, it does not matter how many times you say it or how hard they think about it or how good they are at trying to do that. They won't be able to, So at that point, then you need to strengthen. There's no other way around it. And the same kind of thing, like if somebody has the strength to do something and they're exhibiting this pattern because it's just a learned pattern, that's the way they've always done it, throwing more quad hypertrophy at them is not going to teach them how to do it a better way. One thing I wanted to ask you, actually, you mentioned ankle jammed up, hip jammed up. I know mobility is important with sprinting, of course. Like any other speed related activity, mobility is important. And so there's definitely mobility that's important. But I was wondering what kind of, have you ever run into a structural thing that you can't change and you just have to have a creative strategy to work around it, I guess? To give you a little bit of context, like when you squat, your hips have a certain geometry. So your stance needs to reflect that geometry. And if someone is squatting with a stance that doesn't suit them, their squat's going to look really bad. Has that kind of a thing ever come up for you in sprinting or any other sport that you've coached, I guess?
Most of what I've encountered is similar to what you're talking about, is it's in the weight room, right? Because that exposes all kinds of different movements and different things. And, I think unless there's some sort of, I haven't dealt with anybody, at least from a track and field sense, that has just an absolute disaster in terms of their injury history, where maybe a broken bone or an accident or something like that puts them in a compromised spot. And like you said, most of what we encounter is through the weight room, at least for me. And so that just means having to get creative with how we're selecting the exercise, but that's not a super important thing for us, because what we do in the weight room is a means to an end. It's not actually, sprinting. So I don't know if there's necessarily been a specific example I can think of where, somebody's got this structural limitation that they can't deal with other than, I mean, stride length to some extent is going to be, limited by the structure of your lower limbs. Do you have long legs? Do you have short legs? Um, so, a person with shorter limbs versus longer limbs is going to use a different strategy in terms of stride length and stride frequency to cover the ground. So there's that kind of aspect of it. But, it's not like I'm sitting there going, oh, this person has shorter legs or longer legs. I'm going to try to force them into, whatever style of running. You're going to let them find that natural solution for themselves. So, and I mean, yeah, like I said, it's kind of tough to think of an example, because I think for the most part, the limits in mobility with at least sprinting is you can teach and help them get to a lot of the positions that they need to be in. Some of the other events, something like hurdles, or some of the other events that require more extreme ranges of mobility, pole vault and hurdles are kind of, yeah, the two examples I can think of where maybe somebody's just not structurally built to be into those positions. But I think for the most part with sprinting, you can help people get into good spots from a mobility standpoint.
Mm. Yeah. I guess sprinting, the positions are not super extreme.
Yeah, relative to those other events.
Yeah, you're not approaching end range at any point, really. I like the point you made about not forcing somebody into a specific strategy. I think it's sprinting is a little bit more of like maybe an instinctive thing. Obviously, there's a proper, more efficient way to do it, but it's kind of one of those things that people are going to be able to figure out a way that works for them. And if you can kind of combine that with, the widely accepted middle of the Venn diagram positions, techniques, things like that, then you're going to have a pretty solid end product. But you're not going to convince or try to coach a particularly tall sprinter into running like someone who's 5'10", because that's the ideal height for a sprinter. You're not going to have someone who's really short trying to run like someone who's 5'10", like, because there's the most efficient way to do something conceptually doesn't mean that's the way everyone should be doing it, because at a certain point you need to let people figure out what's going to work for them, and not try to keep them in this box of the absolute correct or the absolute most efficient way of doing something.
Yeah, and this is probably like, so I can get into some of the specifics then if you want, because I think then if we go back to the top and you look at that Venn diagram, what's in the middle? Is it potentially restricting? Is it, going to force maybe that square peg into the round hole? And with a lot of different things that I've looked at, I've tried to make that middle of the Venn diagram, at least again from my personal way of what am I looking for, as like without restrictions to body types and some of those structural things that you can't change. So if I'm looking at somebody upright sprinting, right, I'm looking for the torso and the shin angles to match when they're striking the ground, looking to land with a dorsiflexed or a toe up position, so they're striking the ground flat and striking the ground just ahead of the hip. So those are some of the positions I'm looking for as somebody's sprinting upright and they're landing on the ground. Doesn't matter if you're 6'5", like Bolt, or it doesn't matter if you're 5'5", like Christian Coleman, for example, from the States, right, where there's almost a foot difference in terms of stature. They could both achieve those positions. So something like that doesn't include stride length, stride frequency. Those are things that the athlete can figure out for themselves. That's something that's on the outside of the Venn diagram. So, hey, you want to use a little more frequency because that's comfortable? Use more frequency. You want to use a little more length because you're a taller, longer individual? Use more length. So yeah, it's good that you bring up that point, because now, going into the specifics, right here, the postures and positions I'm looking for. And yeah, you're talking about shorter, taller people. That's where the the differences can be. They might use different length and frequency strategies. So I'm not going to force that short sprinter to try to cover more ground. They might want to move their limbs faster, but are you still hitting those good, efficient positions? And a little bit, I mean, with me, I don't know how it looks for you for squatting. The only two things I have in the middle of my Venn diagram for squatting is, are your feet flat, and is your back flat? Because I have never seen a good squat where somebody's feet are coming off the ground, or they're rolling forward into flexion, or super extended backwards. Obviously, for us squatting, we don't have the same restrictions as you, because you have rules of the sport to deal with. But it's, again, you're going to deal with different body types. So maybe somebody's going to get full range of motion, maybe somebody's not. But are your feet flat? Yeah. Is your back flat? Yeah. Okay. We're probably going to keep you in a safe position in order to execute that movement, whether it's a 2-foot squat, a single foot squat, um, across the board. So yeah, it's good that you bring that point up, because that's, again, another reason why I've really kind of been drawn towards this Venn diagram
Mm-hmm.
model of how you think about movement.
Yeah, I think I was curious where we were going to find the overlaps. And so I mentioned the structural, or the two parts of the physical: structural and non-structural, things you can't change, things you can.
Yeah.
And then there's the skill component. Um, it sounds to me like the stride length versus stride frequency is kind of like your version of the structural things that you could change, but this is what this person has found to be optimal for their body, and they're not going to change their body. You still have the same like strength deficits or force production deficits in sprinting as you do in powerlifting, and then there's the same skill component. So I think that's an interesting crossover there.
It maybe just exists in a different part of our process or journey that we use, right? Like,
Yeah.
I kind of have it, I guess, built into the Venn diagram, which is the first part of the processes where you have it built in later on.
Well, I think it is built in very early for me as well, actually.
Okay.
I think it's just like, for your athlete, it's more like leg length and segment length potentially, and like general height is the anatomy that's limiting things. And for me, it's like segment length for sure as well, and hip geometry is the other one. We're gonna change somebody's squat stance. We're gonna change someone's bench grip width, deadlift stance, deadlift grip width, squat grip width. All these things are gonna change. Bar position is gonna change based on someone's anatomy. Like we talked a little while ago about a high bar versus a low bar squat. And most people squat low bar, but not everybody. If you can maintain a really, really upright position and have very strong quads, then a high bar squat might be better for you. Obviously, if you have deep hip sockets, then you're going to have a very small window that you can squat in. If you have shallow hip sockets, you have a very wide range that you can squat in. So then at that point, maybe if you have deep hip sockets, we're going to change your stance so that you can squat deeper and abide by the rules. If you have shallow hip sockets, we're going to maybe change your stance to get you to squat a little bit higher so that you abide by the rules, but just barely, instead of sinking 8 inches below parallel. So there's a lot of things. Well, exactly. So there's a lot of things to take into account, but that is probably the first thing that we try to change, is just get somebody into a position that allows them to move as good as they can for them. And it's going to depend on how things look to me, of course, but also how things feel to them. And if things look pretty good, but maybe not 100%. But to them, it feels like, yeah, that's right on the money. Then that's fine. We don't need to change things any further than that. And then you start to go a little bit further, and if you're still seeing different compensation patterns, is that a technical thing that we need to cue, or is that a strength deficit that we need to prescribe different exercises for? Yeah, but I thought it was really interesting to see that kind of that overlap in, or the difference in how anatomy impacts our decision making and things like that.
Well, yeah, and the different movements, different sports.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't know, do you use the same principles around the squat with non-power lifters as you do with power lifters?
To an extent, I agree with, the foot flat, back flat. That's, I think, a very simplified way to describe it, of course. But, I can't find any gripes with it, because a lot of the issues that I would think are not encompassed in that are, like, if you really think about it, are encompassed in that. You're not going to keep your back flat without a good core brace. You're likely not going to have flat feet without a good squat stance, or, stable hips. The only other thing I would say is, like, knee stability is probably something that's important, which you could have flat feet and your hips and knees are kind of going all over the place. But if you're doing those things, chances are it's probably a pretty good squat. Yeah, those are the two non-negotiables, I would say, for squatting. I do treat non-powerlifters a little bit different, in that there's not the same focus on depth, and there's not necessarily the same focus on absolute number. Obviously, if a powerlifter is having a hard time getting to depth, we'll change their stance as much as we need to. We'll change their mobility routine as much as they need to. We'll have them do different activation exercises, things like that, until they can get to depth. If it's a general fitness person, the depth doesn't really matter. I think as long as they're going through their full range of motion, that's awesome. If they have different restrictions, then that's probably something good to address as well, but the reason for it changes. And it depends on the goal too. There's a lot of decisions I would make. I mentioned changing a stance to artificially heighten the squat depth. That is something that will allow you to lift more weight without necessarily making you stronger, if we can have that distinction.
Just playing with leverages.
Yeah, there's a lot of decisions that we make in powerlifting that allow you to lift more weight without making you stronger. Another good example would be arching in the bench press. You go through a full range of motion bench press, develop your pecs and triceps through a larger range of motion, you're going to develop more strength. But if you have a higher arch, you're going through less range of motion, you're going to lift more weight. So those are the kinds of decisions that we make with powerlifters that we might do with a non-powerlifter, but that's a conversation to be had instead of a decision that's getting made.
Yeah, like I said, I was just kind of curious if, how you went about that. Because, yeah, obviously the, feet flat, back flat, that's such a, like you mentioned, it is simplified. There's a bit of a process to get to narrowing it down to just those two things. But yeah, I was just curious because, again, I don't deal with the same restrictions that you do, right? It doesn't matter how much weight the athletes I work with lift. They need to be getting stronger, but the absolute number doesn't necessarily matter. And, the age-old question when they ask, oh, how low should I go? I want you to go as low as you can with your feet flat and your back flat. If one of those two things falls apart, when it does, that's how far you can squat. So if you
That's
start to squat down and, oh, I feel my heels coming up, okay, you've gone too far.
Yeah.
Because then at least we're keeping them in the safe range. So yeah, I was just curious if you just apply the concepts you have from powerlifting to all the squatting that you do, or if there was, maybe do the non-negotiables change from one population to the other? But it sounds like
Yeah.
it's
Well,
relatively similar outside of the sport considerations, like you said, load and some leveraging things.
yeah. Well, and that was something that I was kind of thinking about before we hopped on. Um, is that these, there's the structural anatomical things, there's the strength, force production things, and then there's the skill component things that kind of apply to every sport or every movement, every exercise you could do. Um, and I think the same non-negotiables apply to every exercise regardless. Um, and depending on the population, depending on your skill, you might go about achieving those things a little bit differently. But yeah, I think there are, like, squatting is squatting, the how you do it depends on your goals and depends on your sport. But at the end of the day, you're right, you do need feet flat, back flat.
Well, for me, that just is what ended up in the middle of the Venn diagram.
Yeah, no,
You
you're
look at
right.
how do weightlifters squat? Okay, how do powerlifters squat? How do athletes from this sport squat? And you end up with 4 or 5 circles there, and you go, okay, well, none of them use a rounded spine, and none of them take their feet off of the floor. So, okay, those obviously must be the non-negotiable pieces of the squat. And then, yeah, depending on if you're in the weightlifting world or it's a means to achieve a training adaptation, or if you're a power lifter or whatever. For me, as I just went through it, that's what ended up in the middle of the Venn diagram. So that's how I ended up with those non-negotiable
Yeah,
factors of
I
that.
I do actually think that in the weightlifting world, it's a little bit different because I think they value being upright more than they value being flat with their back. So I think
But it's
with
relatively
them,
neutral.
it is relatively neutral. And I think if you asked anybody, they would say neutral is ideal,
Yeah.
but they need that thoracic extension, to be able to get into some of those positions.
And thoracic extension, I'd mostly be looking at the lumbar
For
spine.
sure.
That's the area you would want to, I guess that's not included in depth in the, feet flat, lumbar flat. Maybe I should change it. Tell everybody, yeah, lumbar flat, lumbar flat.
Lumbar
What does
flat.
that mean?
Yeah.
Be like, don't worry about it. Just flat lumbar.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in powerlifting, the upper back collapsing or rounding is something that happens too. So yeah,
Yeah.
it changes a little bit based on the sport, but I think the intention of it is that you need to be in a relatively neutral position so that you're relatively safe. Obviously, if you're lifting weights, injuries can happen at any time, so you're never 100%. But as long as you're doing your best, then that's all you can ask.
Yeah.
And then stability is the other. Stability for the purpose of strength is the other part. So yeah, how that looks, for a weightlifter, being more upright, a little bit more extended is going to be a little bit more stable for them, because for them it's going to be a lot of shoulder stability is the going to be the weakest link in the chain. Versus for a powerlifter, it's going to be, depending on who you are, it'll be a hip thing, it'll be an upper back thing, or a lower back thing probably. But a good strong core brace is going to be the solution, or at least part of the solution, to any of those issues.
Yeah.
Anyway, and same kind of thing with the foot, is it's stability at the end of the day. Stability for the purpose of strength and safety is really all you need for powerlifting. Just stability. Stability breeds strength.
I'd go one step further and say stability breeds just athleticism, period. Like
That's fair.
you if you've ever described somebody as a wet noodle, right? It's just like, yeah, they can't transmit any force. They just like,
the least
yeah,
athletic food.
the least athletic of all the foods. So, because yeah, I mean, it's a huge part of everything in sprinting too, and even with, sprinting, at least to me, doesn't fall into just one Venn diagram. You need to have a couple because, what am I looking for at the start in terms of positions and postures is going to be different than what I'm looking for in acceleration, which could be different from upright because you are in radically different positions and you're applying force in a really different way. Um, Especially with the blocks because you have an outside implement that you're applying force into. Um, but yeah, that stability aspect is there all the time. If I'm not stable, I can't apply force into the blocks or into the ground or underneath me into the ground the way
Mhm.
that I need to as I move from the start of the run into the acceleration into the upright phase as I'm going through. So,
Mhm. That was something actually that I wanted to ask you. Well, first, actually, we talked about that earlier. The stability versus the speed is a very interesting because stability it's necessary for force production, which is necessary for speed,
yeah,
but stability is slow itself.
yes,
So that's an interesting dynamic, I think. But I think you're right that that stability breeds athleticism, and what stability means changes based on the sport and changes based on the movement and changes what you're doing.
oh,
Um,
100%,
yeah.
100%.
But I did want to ask you what some of the you mentioned the positions with the shin angle and the torso angle being the same,
Yeah.
um, landing relatively flat foot, a little bit in front of the hip. Um, are there other non-negotiables for upright sprinting? And then how does it change based on, the point of the race? Obviously, you mentioned start being something different, and potentially it changes based on the race. In the 400 or the 300 or the 200, you have turns, which changes
Yeah.
things a little bit, I'm sure. Yeah, what are the other like non-negotiables you're looking at as some of the maybe the more fringe cases, I guess?
Yeah. If I try to crash course it here, if we go from like the start to
Yeah,
the finish,
I'm interested.
the dorsiflex or the flat foot is non-negotiable throughout. It's it's the way we need to contact the ground to apply force in the most effective way. It's also imperative that even in the recovery in the swing portion, we have the foot in a dorsiflex position because that helps us with the stretch reflex from the hip, both swinging the leg forward and driving the leg backwards. So that dorsiflex position does a lot throughout the entire portion of the race. The shin and the torso angles matching, that also doesn't really change throughout. If you look at somebody as they're accelerating, the angle at which they're at will change from, let's say, that 45-degree angle when they come out of the start to that almost perfect 90-degree when they're running later. But you still want to see those two angles match because that's a sign of efficient force production. Because if my torso is pointed one way and my shin is pointed another way, you're not applying the force to send you in the
Sorry.
direction you want to go.
Yeah, sorry for laughing. I was just imagining someone bent over running with
Well,
vertical shins, and it's hilarious to
no,
think
but
about.
in all honesty, you see that happen sometimes with acceleration because somebody wants to have that feeling of being low in that aggressive position and they don't have the strength to be there. So their lower body is going upright to help them get the force that they need, but they just bend over and hinge at the hips, and then you don't get efficient force transfer. So, I mean, that happens throughout the entire run. One of the interesting differences is when you get into the longer stuff, maybe a little bit in the 300, definitely in the 400, is the amount of extension the lower limb goes through. So in pure speed, we don't actually see full triple extension. It's a little bit reduced because we're basically at an interplay of the more I extend my leg, the more force I'm going to put into the ground, but the longer I spend on the ground. So it slows down my stride. So you get a lot of triple extension as you drive the leg down into the ground and push, but you don't get full triple extension. If you watch like the best of the best in the 100 or the 200, they're not fully triple extending or forcing that triple extension because they'd spend too long on the ground. But if you watch 400-meter runners, it's a strategy they use to help combat some of the fatigue. Say some of the fatigue as if it's not that much, the tremendous, brutal amount of fatigue you end up with in the 400. So that's an example of maybe a position change, which if I'm looking at upright sprinting for pure speed, we don't want that complete full triple extension. But if it's the closing 100-meter of a 400-meter race, you need to do that in order to maximize the efficiency of your stride. The only other spot where you'd see that full extension is out of the blocks, that first step. But yeah, I don't know if that, again, those are some of the things that would be negotiable and non-negotiable throughout, I guess, the phases of the race. Yeah, because you can't just narrow down, oh, only upright running happens or only this happens, because you transition from one stage to the next. But yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. I hope I explained that in a somewhat coherent way.
Yeah, definitely. That was really interesting to hear. You explained, how things change through the race. And that change with the 400 is something that I've never thought about, never heard about. I think I knew that you never went through full triple extension with sprints most of the time, because of that, interplay that you talked about. But with the 400, that's really interesting. And it makes a lot of sense that you would do that now. Is that something that's intentional or something that's like more subconscious? Like, is it a strategy to be implemented, or is it more of like a compensation pattern that is happening despite your best efforts?
It's a bit of both, because at the end of the day, once you're running upright, it's all about the vertical force production. And the vertical force production that you need to generate is based off of your body weight. And so there's basically, you could think about it as a threshold of, I need to apply X amount of newtons into the ground to project myself. And sure, you're sweating, but I doubt your weight changes drastically from the point in the 400 where you were 100 meters through versus 300 meters through. So basically what you're dealing with is the force that needs to be applied into the ground isn't changing, but how you now need to apply that force is changing because you're fatigued. So you compensate a little bit by spending a little bit more time on the ground to apply that force a little bit longer, because you're not fresh enough to apply it in that short window of time that you could if you were not under fatigue. And that's something, if you wanted an example of someone who is weak or doesn't have the strength or the force generation qualities for sprinting, you see them spend more time on the ground. So if you see somebody really following through, really pushing and extending backside, that could be a sign of like a mechanical or a physical detriment where you go, they're not strong enough or powerful enough to be in those positions. So it's a strategy they definitely use to maintain their stride length and the force into the ground. So it's a mix of both, because the fatigue doesn't really give you a choice. So
that's very, very cool. That's interesting. That I think could feed into that. That reminds me a lot of some of the stuff I see in powerlifting for sure, where it's the force you need to produce doesn't change because the weight doesn't change throughout a set, but your ability to produce that force changes through a set as you fatigue. So you see some of the same kinds of compensation patterns towards the end of a set that you didn't see at the beginning of a set. So that's interesting. I don't want to get into that too much. I think that'll be something good for us to talk about next week,
Yeah.
as we dive a little bit deeper into the like assessment and things like that. Um, I did want to touch on the bench press and the deadlift non-negotiables really quick,
Yeah. For the viewers.
as we're running out of time, and then I think that'll give us a nice platform to leap off of next week.
And I'd be curious to
Into
hear this too. I mean, I have athletes
Yeah,
that deadlift and bench. So, and I'm sure
yeah,
everyone listening or watching
yeah,
does as well. So
yeah.
the powerlifting
Um,
master can enlighten us.
so for the bench press, we have the rules as well. Like we have to, the non-negotiable for the squat is we have to hit depth. Bench press, the non-negotiables in terms of positioning anyway are same feet flat, back on the bench, butt on the bench, head on the bench, and hands on the bar, obviously.
I would hope.
Yeah. And there's a width limit. There's rings on the bar that you need to be touching or inside of.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So you can't go as wide as possible.
Yeah.
There's a limit to how wide you can go.
Can't go snatch grip bench.
No, you cannot go snatch grip bench. And the non-negotiables that we're looking for there is leg stability, essentially lower body stability. There's a couple different strategies that maybe I'll get into that next week. There's a kind of, if you're interested, you can look up 120 plus bench press. A lot of them don't have a conventional leg or lower body stability technique that you would see in the lighter weight classes. And then the other big one is upper back stability, essentially. So that kind of, the feet and the head and the butt are all rule based. I think for the most part, they're stability based as well. And then the leg stability, upper back stability are safety stability for force production based. And then with the deadlift, it's pretty similar to the squat, feet flat, back flat. And with the back flat comes the upper back stability and the core stability. The other big one is patience coming off of the floor. Because, and that gets into a little bit more of a technical thing. But that's just, like you mentioned, a sign of efficient force production. We do a lot of work to get into a strong, efficient position at the floor. And if you yank on the bar, that position is going to change. But if you are patient and you're pushing off of the floor, allowing that back angle to stay the same essentially until you pass your knees. Once the bar's past your knees, then the hips are going to come forward and the back is going to go from, 60 degrees or 30 degrees or whatever to vertical. But you want to make sure that that lower back, your back in general is staying at the same angle, coming off of the floor until you get to that point where you can push into hip extension. Yeah, those are the big ones. And I think that gives us a good leaping off point to get more specific next week for sprinting or running in general and the three main lifts in general next week.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear about, what you bring to the table with, the sport of powerlifting and how they do it. And are there any strategies or, tricks of the trade that we can just pull into our domain of training and make the athletes better? So
yeah, definitely.
That'll definitely be a good one.
I'm excited to continue this conversation for sure.
It could go for hours. It really could.
Well, it's going to, because we're over an hour now, and it'll be at least an hour next week, I'm sure, as well.
Yeah, probably.
One strategy I suppose you could use to increase performance in some degree is music selection.
Just get you fired up.
I know I have used music to increase my performance a time or two. Yeah. What were you using to increase performance this week?
I actually haven't been listening to much or anything at all when I've been working out this week. Because I've been trying that stupid
Been
jog
jogging.
to the hill and do the hill excels and then jog back. And I hate headphones. They just like for work now, they just drive me nuts. So I haven't listened to anything specific for working out, but for like work and writing and doing other things. As much as I, you know, sometimes I don't like words with music because then I sing along and I get distracted. I've had a lot of Black Keys playing this week.
I like the Black Keys.
The Black Keys are sick. It's just catchy. It's fun. Kind of puts you in a good mood so you can write. Again, sometimes it gets a little distracting because I just end up singing along. But yeah, Black Keys. I mean, they're sick. I've seen them live. They're good. They're good. I know they're not metal, but just because it's not metal doesn't mean it's not good. It's not catchy. So
That's right. That's right.
yeah, I've been getting a lot of work done to that this week.
Right on. Yeah, for my writing, I've still been jamming out to the like lo-fi hip hop stuff, which is it's just nice and same kind of feels good and is relaxing. On Monday for all my programming, I did listen to a decent amount of Unleash the Archers per your suggestion. I much prefer them to Death.
I figured you might.
I
I like
enjoyed the
them
power
both.
metal. Yeah, yeah. I can see the merit in both. It's just that's more up my alley.
Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed the power metal. It is vibrant. It's got a lot of movement to it. It's not just like a lot of metal, in my opinion, just sounds like everything's happening really fast all the time. So there's not like a lot of movement throughout the song.
Yeah.
But what I noticed with them is like the tempo changes, the intensity changes, the rhythm changes often, and you get this nice flow and a lot of nice feels and riffs and stuff. So I did enjoy them. And then when I was in the gym yesterday, I started off with a little bit of Roy Jones Jr.
He's
I don't
got
know
some
if you
good stuff, man.
he
He's
does.
got some good besides just Can't Be Touched or whatever it's called. The one that everyone knows.
Well,
He's got some songs.
That's the one that plays in every single high school football locker room all the time. At least it did
Across.
when I was playing. Yeah.
Yeah, but he's got stuff beyond that too.
Oh yeah.
He's got some tunes that will 100% fire you up before
Yeah.
you
Yeah. I
get in
got
the
a few.
ring or whatever you're going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I got a few. So that got me pumped up for my deadlifts. And then while I actually was deadlifting, I was listening to Rise Against. They got some good tunes. And then I haven't listened to a lot of Foo Fighters, but I got into some of their stuff. Pretender is obviously a really good one. And I went a little bit deeper to see what else they have because that's really the only song that I knew by them. But yeah, so that's what I've been doing this week for the most part.
You had a big music adventure this week. Just all kinds of stuff. That's sick.
Yeah, a little bit, but yeah, it was good. A little bit heavier than what I've been listening to late. I guess you could argue that Ice Cube is heavier than Rise Against, but you could also argue it the other way.
Ice Cube's definitely more aggressive. That'll get you fired up better, in my opinion.
Yeah. But, yeah, good stuff. It was nice. I find for myself that music is like if I hit on the right song, if I'm listening to the right stuff for that time, I'm having the best time in the gym. And if I'm not listening to the right music, it's a lot harder for me to get there.
I definitely agree.
Yeah.
All right then. Well, we'll wrap up then. So it was a good talk today though. And I'm looking forward to next week and
Yeah. To be continued.
Learning lots. I'm definitely excited for that.
Yeah.
So yeah, guess we'll wrap that up.
Right on. Thanks, world. That was the Speed Strength Show. I'm Braden.
I'm Tommy. And we will see you, talk to you, or hear you next week.
Peace.